Hello everybody, it's Tanya and welcome to today's video. Leo Tolstoy's 3 short stories, which I want to talk about with you today, are some of his earliest works. But it is in them that he for the first time raises questions and issues and uses certain narrative techniques which he will later use in his magnum opus, War and Peace. And in this video, I want to recreate the times when he was writing these 3 short stories. I want to recreate the story behind the Sevastopol Sketches. Those of you who watched my previous video, 2024 favorite books, know that this was one of my favorite books that I read in 2024. And I wanted to make a big, extensive, nice video about these short stories to inspire you to also read them. And so this is one of 2 videos which I will dedicate to these short stories. And this video is dedicated, as I have already said, to the history behind these short stories. We will recreate the time when he was writing them, and we will recreate the time through his letters, some excerpts from his letters, from his diaries, as well as letters and diaries of people who surrounded him at that time. I'm super excited. I hope you're going to enjoy this video because I enjoyed immensely preparing for this, and I'm looking forward to sharing everything I found with you. So with this video, I want to see what inspired Leo Tolstoy to write short stories and later a huge novel dedicated to war. As well as I wanted to find the first reception of his earliest works. I wanted to see how the public received his earliest works for the first time. And you will see this in this video. The time when he served in the army as an artillery officer became a forming time in his life. It was the time when his values and his outlooks on life were being shaped. And I talked about this a little bit in my previous video, which I made for Haji Murat, because he wrote Haji Murat. It's like the last work that he wrote in his life. But it was based a lot on his life experiences as an officer, but at that time in Caucasus. So his time in Caucasus you can watch in that video. I will link it up here. But in this video we will talk about his time in Crimea War, when he participated in the Crimea War. The Sevastopol Sketches are not only a work of literature, they are also a true historical account of an eyewitness account of real events that took place during the siege of Sevastopol in 1854 to 1855. It is an account of real events and real battles that took time during the siege, as well as living conditions of the Russian army, as well as some interesting interaction between the rivaling armies, which I didn't really expect to see, but it was interesting for me to read about. Also a document of human condition at war, human condition at the face of death, with no real dramatization, no real exaggeration or beautifying the whole event. One of the techniques that he used here is describing something out of the normal, describing it as normal. And that's why the events in war, the whole experience of war in this book, it is not romanticized at all, which I enjoyed very much. I loved it about these short stories. Russian army lost in that Crimea War, and Sevastopol fell. Sevastopol fell on August 27, 1855. Leo Tolstoy participated in the last assault of Sevastopol. He was defending Sevastopol, and at that time he was in charge of 5 cannons. And when Sevastopol fell, he took it as his personal tragedy. The fall happened on August 27, on the day right before his birthday. The next day was his birthday. The fall of the city became a personal tragedy for him. And there is an excerpt from a letter that he wrote to his aunt, which I want to read for you. He wrote, "The 28th, my birthday, was for me a memorable and sad day. I cried when I saw the city on fire and French flags flying over our bastions. Young Leo Tolstoy was one of the officers defending Sevastopol during the Crimean War, which was fought between Russian Empire, and the alliance of three countries, the Ottoman Empire, United Kingdom, and France, which wanted to avoid the expansion of the Russian Empire, and they wanted to limit Russian Empire's access to the Black Sea. And that's why they supported the Ottoman Empire. The Crimean War was fought from October 1853 to February 1856, and by some historians it is described as World War Zero, predecessor of this concept of World War. So it was a big war. And Siege of Sevastopol is an episode during that Crimean War, when Sevastopol was being sieged by the alliance forces of Ottoman Empire, French army, and English army, and Russian army was defending Sevastopol. Ivan Sergeyevich Turgenev, another famous, beloved Russian classic Russian writer, at that time he wasn't a friend with Leo Tolstoy. They have never met in person, but they did interact through letters. So they sent some letters to each other because Leo Tolstoy had literary ambitions at that time. Ivan Turgenev was already an established author at that time. So they had relationships through letters. And Ivan Turgenev wrote to Leo Tolstoy when he learned that young Tolstoy was in Sevastopol. He said, "It scares me to think about where you are now. Although, on the other hand, I'm also happy for you, as you get to experience all these new sensations and trials. But there is a limit to everything. Don't tempt your fate. It would be good if you could get out of Crimea. You have proven sufficiently enough that you aren't a coward, and a military career is not for you. Your calling is to be a writer, an artist of thoughts and words. Your weapon is a quill, not a sword. As for the muses, they don't only dislike fuss, but are also jealous." So it was already closer to the end of the siege, but Ivan Turgenev was encouraging Leo Tolstoy to return, to come back. But let's start from the beginning. Leo Tolstoy arrived in Sevastopol on November 7th, 1854. So the siege started October 1854. He arrived there November 7th, 1854. So pretty much right after the siege started. And he arrived there on his own request, because before he served as an artillery officer, but in Kishinev. But as a young writer with ambitions, of course he wants to see the real battle, because at that time in Kishinev there weren't really much military actions. He wanted to participate in the action, and he requested to be transferred to Sevastopol. And that's what he writes to his brother Sergei. "I asked to send me to Crimea partly in order to see the war, but for the most part out of a patriotic feeling, which at that time, I admit, had overcome me." Like I said, Crimea War was a big deal at that time, and the patriotic feeling was present in many young people and many young officers at that time. You will see it will be portrayed in all of these three short stories. A little later, Leo Tolstoy wrote again to the same brother, and that's what he said. It was already November 20th. He writes, "I have learned, experienced, and felt so much this year. I decidedly don't know where to begin my description, and if I am even capable of describing it the way I want to." Course of these short stories, which are thematically, they're separate. Characters are also different. So this is not a continual literary work. Each short story can be read separately on its own and should be read separately on its own. The only theme that unites these short stories is the theme of the siege of Sevastopol. But especially the first story is very different visibly. It's obviously very different in its mood from the other two. The first short story is very excited. This young man, young officer, I feel like Tolstoy was describing himself and he was describing his own feelings right when he arrived in Sevastopol. This young officer is astonished by the spirit of the army, astonished by the strength of the army, by this patriotic feeling which is overflowing in him, and he sees it because he is experiencing it. He sees it in other people as well. The first short story is very filled with this patriotism, and it's very much filled with admiration for the army. Tolstoy was especially astonished by the mood in the army, by the mood of the soldiers. And in his next letter to the same brother Sergei, he writes, "The spirit in the army is beyond any description. Even in the days of ancient Greece, there was no such heroism. A company of sailors almost revolted because of an order to change and remove them from an artillery battery where they had been stationed for 30 days under bombs. 160 people in one crew, all of them wounded, didn't leave their post." And like I said, the first short story very fully reflects this Tolstoy's admiration for mostly soldiers, not so much officers, simple soldiers. This euphoria didn't last very long. And already on November 23rd, in his diary, he wrote, "Russia must either fall or be completely transformed." Another quotation from his letter to his brother. "Only our army can stand and win under these conditions." The conditions are, you will read them in the story, they're horrible, basically horrible conditions. The city is just dirt, lots of wounded soldiers, lots of blood, lots of dying soldiers, corpses, this type of condition. He also mentions in his diary, he also mentions in this letter the captive British and French soldiers, and he writes about them that they are valiant people. And he compares them to Russian soldiers, and Russian soldiers he describes like that. "Ours soldier is some gamekeeper, small, infested with lice, somehow shriveled, but the spirit is beyond any description." So the spirit is the main thing that really inspired him and really surprised him, the spirit of the army. Tolstoy's euphoria didn't last very long because he sees the management of the army. He sees the behavior of the officers and of the higher ranks of the army. He sees the financial fraud constantly being committed. He sees the officers' hypocrisy. He sees how they don't really think that much about the country. They mostly think about their ranks. They mostly think about how other people will perceive them, what other people will think about them, how it looks on, from the perspective of others rather than what it actually is. And in the stories, you will not see so much admiration for officers. Officers are portrayed very critically. The admiration is for the soldiers, for the simple soldiers and sailors. At some point, Tolstoy starts to write an article called "On Negative Qualities of Russian Soldiers and Officers," which I guess the title speaks for itself. And out of writing this article, he and his friends, who also had literary ambitions, they come up with the idea to start publishing a newspaper right there, like right in Sevastopol, right at the front. The newspaper, was supposed to be mostly for the soldiers, not so much for the officers, mostly for the soldiers. And there were two working titles that they came up with. The first title was Солдатский вестник in Russian. In English, it's something like a soldier's bulletin. And later the title was changed, reworked, and it became Военный листок, a war leaflet. The plan for the newspaper was to spread the correct information about the military situation at the front, as well as publication of war songs, literary materials, and religious teaching for the soldiers. Tolstoy was ready to invest his own money into this project. The commander-in-chief, General Gorchakov, gave them his full support, and the first issue of the newspaper was already printed, but of course they had to receive a permission from higher authorities, from the emperor, and unfortunately Emperor Nicholas I didn't support the initiative. And he advised to young people to send their material to already established newspapers, and specifically he mentioned the newspaper, military newspaper, which was called Русский инвалид, which is a very strange name for a newspaper, like a Russian invalid, but it was called, I assume it was called that way because the part of the proceeds from that newspaper was allocated to veterans, disabled veterans of the war with Napoleon, so of the war of 1812. So that's why it was called Russian Invalid. And it wasn't new. Of course, they understood that they could send their materials to the newspaper. They could do it themselves. They didn't have to receive his permission for that. They wanted permission for their own newspaper. But unfortunately, Tsar Nicholas I refused. But then Tolstoy repurposed this idea, and he immediately wrote to the editor-in-chief of one of the most popular magazines in Russia at that time, Современник. He wrote to Nikolai Alexeyevich Nekrasov. Nekrasov was in charge of Современник. In English, it's something like the contemporary. And it was a very popular, very well-known magazine, literary magazine, started by Pushkin, which published literary works as well as works on history, on ethnography, some literary criticism. And it was very popular and very, very well known. Tolstoy promised to Nekrasov to send to him 2 to 5 pages of latest news from the front, written by qualified young writers like himself. Of course, he immediately received the reply from Nekrasov, and that's what Nekrasov wrote. He said that he was not only ready, but even delighted to give Tolstoy as much space in Современник as necessary. I trust your taste and talent more than my own. So from Nekrasov, Tolstoy had the green light, and he started working on his articles and his documents, because these 3 short stories by the contemporaries, they were called articles. They were not called short stories. They referred to them as articles. Tolstoy submitted, for the first time, a few articles from him and his friends to Nekrasov. But the idea of constant work and constantly writing about the war and about the siege didn't really inspire his friends. So very quickly his friends just fell off and he was left alone. And in his diary he wrote, I have to write alone. I will describe Sevastopol in different phases along with the ideal of officer's life. And it was the first mention of his idea for the short stories. The initial idea was for a short story called Sevastopol by Day and Night, which later was separated into the first and the second stories. So the day section was turned into one story, and the night section was turned into the second story in the collection. And he describes his goal for these stories in his diary as follows. To show war not in a proper, beautiful and shiny formation, with music and rataplan, with flying banners and galloping generals, but war for what it truly is, blood, suffering and death. The army infirmary produced the strongest impression on Tolstoy when he first arrived in Sevastopol. And we will follow in his footsteps in the first story. The protagonist of the first story, right after his arrival in Sevastopol, the first place where he goes is the infirmary. The conditions of the infirmary, the conditions of people there, their afflictions, their mood and their spirit, everything, as well as the spirit of the personnel who was working, doctors and the nurses, is reflected in the first short story. But infirmary is a present element in all of the stories. In every single story, the characters first go to the infirmary, experience different emotions there, like our first protagonist is experiencing respect and is experiencing admiration of everyone there. In the second story, it's already despise, and it's already the feeling of like they're in some dirty and unpleasant place. And then the third story also has infirmary. The two brothers, the two main characters of the third story, also first go to the infirmary, where they meet the wounded soldier from the older brother's regiment. So infirmary is a very important part in all of these three short stories. In April 1855, so it's already around like the middle of the siege of Sevastopol, Tolstoy was assigned to the 4th bastion. And 4th bastion was the most dangerous section of the defense of Sevastopol. It was the most afflicted by the enemy's fire, and it was the most bloody section. That's where the most people died. And Tolstoy was assigned there. It is during his time on the 4th bastion that he was working on the first short story, Sevastopol by Day and Night. At that time it was still like this idea of Sevastopol by day and night, later on split. As well as he was writing his novel, The Youth. And he mentions about that in his diary. So April 12th, 4th bastion. I was writing Sevastopol by day and by night. It doesn't seem bad to me. I hope to finish it tomorrow. What a great spirit the sailors have. How much higher they are than our soldiers. Though my soldiers are also lovely, and I have a great time with them. And then on April 13th, he writes, the same 4th bastion, which I begin to enjoy quite a bit. I write a lot. I have recently finished Sevastopol by day and by night, and have written a little of youth. Constant charm of danger, the observations on the soldiers who I am living with, the sailors and the war itself are so pleasant that I don't want to leave this place, even more so because I'd love to be present at the assault, if it happens. Now I think is the good time to talk about Leo Tolstoy as an officer. So how other people saw him, like what other people thought of him, because obviously we can see his perspective of other people in the short stories, but it is interesting how other people saw him. And I promise you there is some very interesting observations on his behavior and like what he did and what kind of officer he himself was. So there isn't much detail, but there are a few recollections from people who used to serve with him in the same battalion. And so they write that Tolstoy had an interesting kind of playful I don't know if habit is the word here, but it's just something that he liked doing, that he regularly do. And the habit was to walk in front of the mouth of a loaded cannon in the few seconds that separated the firing of the cannonball from lighting of the fuse. So I guess he just liked kind of playing with his fate, or maybe it was also kind of his way of testing how courageous he is, because being truly courageous is also a topic that is constantly present in the short stories. He very often in these short stories shows officers who are either pretending to be courageous and they think how other people see them, if they see them as cowards or if they see them as courageous officers, and he shows like actually courageous people. So I don't know, maybe it has to do something with that. So yeah, walking in front of the mouth of the loaded cannon, that's one recollection. Another recollection is that he liked if there was like a tourist on the bastion, a tourist similar to the protagonist of the first short story. So a person who is not actually part of the regiment, someone who just came to see what is going on, how it all looks. Basically, yeah, the protagonist of the first short story. So if people like that came to the bastion, Tolstoy immediately ordered to fire the cannon in order for the enemy to fire back and the tourist to be present during that backfire. Again, yeah, that's something interesting. Maybe he wanted, yeah, to give them their time worth, I don't know. And then another recollection is made and is found in the diary of Porfiry Glebov, who was an assistant chief of staff of artillery of the Southern Army. And the recollection was the diary entry was made on September 13, 1855, and he wrote, "Tolstoy is eager to take part in the action, but as a partisan. He removes from himself the difficulties and hardships of war. He goes to different places as a tourist. But as soon as he hears a shot or fire anywhere, he immediately goes there to take part in the battle and to take part in the action. But as soon as the action is over, he again leaves of his own will, wherever the road takes him." So you can see that Tolstoy himself was kind of a tourist. He was an officer, but he also was curious to see what was happening, and I see him more as a journalist. He is a young man with literary ambitions, and he sees his literary ambition in this realistic writing. So as a realist writer, obviously you're not supposed to come up with things. You're supposed to describe the truth. You're supposed to describe reality. Well, process it, right? Process it through your understanding, process it through your feelings, but then still write the truth. And he makes also a point in the short stories that the main character of the stories is the truth. So it was really important for him to write precisely as close to the reality as possible. But in order to do that, you have to see the reality. You have to experience the reality. And I think that's what he was doing. So he didn't want to sit in one place, time on end and not go anywhere. He wanted to see things and he wanted to experience that. So that's how I see his behavior as a curious young man who wants to experience and to live through historically significant events as much as possible. That's my understanding. And this position of a tourist anywhere you go is reflected also in the short stories, but also in War and Peace, where Pierre Bezukhov is also kind of a tourist at war. It was also mentioned by someone that Tolstoy didn't only stay in Sevastopol. He went to Simferopol. Simferopol is another city in Crimea which was not assaulted, and he went there to meet ladies, to play piano with the ladies. So he was still a young man. He was enjoying his life. and he tried to do it to the fullest. So he also enjoyed his time there, to some degree. And as I mentioned, at that time he was working on the first story, and he noticed that when he was working on it, he noticed he started very meticulously working specifically on the first part, so Sevastopol by day. And he was inserting so many details about the city during the day that he decided that it would be better to split the story. And that was the moment when the story was split into two. And Sevastopol in December became the first part. So Sevastopol by day turned into Sevastopol in December. The second part, Sevastopol by night, was turned into the second story. The first short story is written as a live report from the scene of the events, made by the participant of the action. As I already mentioned about the stories and about this first story, it can be considered not only a work of literature, but also a work of history, which represents the actual conditions of people, conditions of the army at the time and during the siege. Tolstoy finished writing it, and he sent the story to Nekrasov, to Nikolai Nekrasov, and that's Nekrasov's reply. He wrote to Tolstoy. The article is written masterfully. It is without a doubt of great interest to the Russian society. Please send us more articles like this one. So, like I mentioned, the contemporaries referred to the stories as articles. They referred to them as, like a live account from the events of the siege. They didn't specifically look at them as a work of literature, although, of course, it was, but it was also, like a journalistic, basically, account for them. That's why they refer to them as articles. The first short story, because it's very optimistic, it is full of patriotism, it is full of admiration for the army and for the soldiers. Of course, it faced no problems with the censorship, it faced no problems with the authorities, and it was easily published in Современник, and it was very warmly and enthusiastically received by the public and the critics. Ivan Sergeyevich Turgenev, in his letter to one of his friends, wrote, Tolstoy's article on Sevastopol is a marvel. I shed a few tears while reading it and shouted hooray. Tolstoy's article has caused a great furor here. In a different letter to a different writer, Sergei Timofeyevich Aksakov, the same Ivan Turgenev wrote, Have you read Tolstoy's article Sevastopol in Современник? I read it at the table, shouted hooray, and drank a glass of champagne to his health. So yeah, Turgenev was very excited for Tolstoy's work. And then Sergei Timofeyevich Aksakov, so the writer to whom Turgenev wrote, replied to him. He said, I read Tolstoy's article with admiration, and in my mind I also shouted hooray to its writer and to the fact that it has been published. A Russian essayist, playwright, and a very notable Slavanophile, Ivan Aksakov, in his letter to his father, wrote, I have read in Современник Tolstoy's Sevastopol in December. A very good thing, after reading which one gets eager to go to Sevastopol, and it seems to you that you won't be a coward, and at the same time you won't put on a pretense bravery, where a subtle and at the same time warm analysis is shown in the works of this Tolstoy. Some of these enthusiastic and warm reviews, of course, reached Leo Tolstoy. And on July 5th, in his diary, he wrote, Now the time has come for me to face the true temptations of vanity. I could gain a lot in this life if I decided to write against my convictions. At the time when Tolstoy was receiving these exciting reviews of his first short story, he had already started working on the second one. He returned to the second story in late June 1855. On June 19th, he returned back to his earlier drafts and he started reworking them and adding new impressions from May. And the main plot of the second story are the events of May 10, 11 and the ceasefire of May 12th. And so all the events that are described in this second short story, the people are all real. These are all real people. Everything and the events are all real. Everything he described everything as it happened. And that's why the working title for the second story was May 10th. Interesting is the ending of the short story, because that's the quotation from the end of it, the end of the second short story. The hero of my novella, whom I love with all my soul, whom I was trying to recreate in all its beauty, and who has always been, is, and will be magnificent, is the truth. So, in this statement, as you see, he pleads his allegiance, I would say, to the truth, to the realism, and the fact that he wants to describe everything as it is, without romanticization, without exaggeration, without romanticization, as it is. The second story in its tone is drastically different from the first one. When you read it, you are a little bit even taken aback. At least I was taken aback. Because the first story is, like I said, is so full of patriotism and faith and belief and admiration. And the second story is like there was a flower and the flower has faded. Because the second short story, the main idea is to show the hypocrisy of officers, the low morals of the officers, their negligence of their duties, their negligence and disrespect to officers of lower ranks, and their disrespect to simple soldiers who are actually sacrificing their lives and who are actually showing bravery and who are actually doing the actual thing, unlike these people who only care for their ranks, who only care for their gain, who only care for their money and perception of ladies, how ladies will think about them, and other officers, what they will think about them. So this kind of dirty side of the army is shown in the second story. With this being the central topic of it, the central topic of the story, you would expect that censorship would not be very happy, and it was not. Tolstoy anticipated it. Tolstoy anticipated the problems with the censorship, and in the drafts of this second short story, we see softer and less offensive expressions put underneath the original statement. Nekrasov, when he received the complete version of the second story from Tolstoy, he wrote to the same Ivan Turgenev. He writes to him after receiving the article. Tolstoy has sent me an article about Sevastopol, but this article is filled with such sober and deep truth, I don't see how it can be published. However, they did try to publish it. They tried to smuggle it into Современник, and they just didn't notify the censoring authorities. They just didn't send the copy to them. But somehow the head of the censorship office, Musin Pushkin, somehow he learned that new Tolstoy's article is going to be published. Well, they didn't know who is the author of the stories at that time, because the first short story was published just under the initials LNT. So the author is not known, but the story became so well known, so famous, so beloved, so everybody was talking about it, everybody was talking about the unknown author. And when the second story arrived, somehow the rumors of it being submitted reached the censorship authorities, and they requested from Nikolai Nekrasov to submit the story for their assessment. And actually the magazine, the batch of the magazines was already printed. It was already printed with the story. But after Musin Pushkin read the story, he just crossed out almost everything there. He crossed out so much. And at the end of the day, he just wrote on the title page that just prohibit and forbid to publish. And the interesting thing is that Современник's issue from August, so issue 8, they were publishing like one issue a month. So the 8th issue of Современник, which was published in August, was published with page 244, followed already by page 286. So they just had to remove Tolstoy's story from the issue which was already published. However, in the middle of August, so just a few weeks later, reworked story of, or what was left of it, with all the Musin Pushkin's cross-outs and prohibition. So everything that was left of the story was allowed for publication. And already the 9th issue of Современник, so the September issue, the next issue of Современник, was published with the remains of Tolstoy's story. It was the first story in the issue. Of course, it was completely uncomparable to the original version, to the author version. It was changed beyond recognition, and no authorship was mentioned. So there was not even initials, there was nothing. Just an article without an author. And Nekrasov wrote about this incident with the censorship to Leo Tolstoy. Of course, he informed Leo Tolstoy about that. He called it an outrageous disgrace. And he wrote, "I won't try to console you with the fact that many find even the printed drips and drabs of your article excellent. For those of us who know the text in the original, it's nothing more than a collection of words with no essence and inner meaning. Your name is not underneath it." Ivan Turgenev read the second story in the original Tolstoy's manuscript, and he described it in his letter to Tolstoy's sister as a terrifying thing. Another famous Russian writer, Alexei Feofilaktovich Pisimsky, who also read the article in the full, he wrote that the article is written so mercilessly, it is hard to read it. The article is mostly written from the third person perspective, but in some episodes, which you will see, Tolstoy uses, as a Russian critic described it, this technique of interior monologue. It is believed by some researchers and by some academics that this Chernyshevsky's reference to this Tolstoy's technique, inner or interior monologue, is the kind of the first description of a technique which is close to our modern stream of consciousness technique. And so the Tolstoy using this technique was one of the first instances of using the inner monologue, the interior monologue, to describe feelings and emotions and experiences of a person. So it's like one of the first instances in literature to used this technique, as well as Chernyshevsky being one of first critics to give a name to it. Well, he called it the interior monologue, or dialectics of the soul, another name that he gave, dialectics of the soul. And later, in the 20th century, it became stream of consciousness. Tolstoy didn't use it throughout the whole story, he only uses in certain moments, as well as in War and Peace. He used it in War and Peace as well, but not throughout the whole work, just in the situations when it is kind of required and when it's the most fitting. So this is the quotation from Chernyshevsky, who is a literary critic, Russian literary critic. He wrote, "The depiction of the inner monologue can be called astonishing without exaggeration." Tolstoy learned about what happened to his second story only in September 1855, and he wrote in his diary the following: "Yesterday I received a letter notifying that the night, the second story, has been disfigured and published. Apparently I am being closely watched by the Blue for my articles. My wish is, however, for Russia to always have such honest writers. It is against my nature to be sweet, as well as to beat the air in my writing and tell stories without a thought and, most importantly, without a purpose." This communication with Nekrasov, notifying Tolstoy of what happened with his second story, happened already in September, and it was already after Sevastopol fell. So at that time, Tolstoy was already working on the last third article or story dedicated to Sevastopol. Leo Tolstoy was present at the fall of Sevastopol, which happened on August 27th. Like I mentioned in the beginning, it happened right before his birthday being August 28th. At that time, Tolstoy was in charge of 5 canons, and his experiences are portrayed in the experiences of one of the characters in the last stories, the younger brother, Volodya, who is this young boy arriving for the first time to Sevastopol. He will also be in charge of a few canons. So kind of Tolstoy gives Volodya his own experiences. This last story is about 2 brothers, an older brother who is already a mature officer who has been at this war for a long time, but he had been wounded, and now he is coming back to Sevastopol after his time in hospital, after his recovery. And on his way to Sevastopol, he just by accident meets his younger brother Volodya, who is a newly graduated, very young 18-year-old boy who is going to Sevastopol just like Tolstoy on his pure feeling of patriotism. And together these 2 brothers come to Sevastopol. And it is their experiences, and the last assault of Sevastopol is shown through their experiences and through their eyes. It is a very tragic story. It is one of the most painful stories, at least it was for me, as well as the most touching, and it's still critical of officers, but already there is love, already there is warmth. So the relationships between brothers, the brothers themselves are very decent, honest people, with very pure and honest feelings. Just the differences are that one of them is an old, mature one, and he has seen all of it, he understands all of it, he knows what this is, and a young, excited boy who is full of romantic ideas, who is full of patriotism, and it's the contrast between these 2 brothers and between the reality and the younger brother that is kind of the main topic of the third story. The story was finished already in November, so middle of November, when Tolstoy was already back in St. Petersburg, and it was published in the first issue of Современник of already next year, 1856. Tolstoy was apparently quite satisfied with the result of the story, because it is then when his full name appears underneath the story, and the Russian public learns the author of these Sevastopol Sketches. The name was signed as Count L.N. Tolstoy. Tolstoy contemporaries highly praised this last third story. Nekrasov already referred to it not as an article, but he referred to it as a novella. So he considered it a fully literary work. Already mentioned before, Nikolai Gavrilovich Chernyshevsky, so the Russian critic, he pointed out Tolstoy's remarkable talent. And in regard to Tolstoy's 3 short stories, he wrote, "We predict that everything that has been up to this day given by Count Tolstoy to our literature is only a pledge of the things he will accomplish in the future. But how rich and wonderful this pledge is." And the Sevastopol stories became the first step on Leo Tolstoy's way to writing war and peace. And the techniques, the topics, some of the characters will be very similar to the characters in the Sevastopol Sketches. After his time in Sevastopol, for 1 year, Tolstoy was still kind of as an officer, but after a year he retired. After returning to St. Petersburg, he, as a young man, he starts leading very socially active life. So it is not so much, that period of his life isn't really rich with literary writings. One of the reasons for that being that his short stories, they were published as a separate book, and they were being sold for a very cheap price. Initially he put the price for like 2 rubles for 1 copy. But later, because they weren't selling very well, he decreased the price to 1.5 rubles, and still they were not selling very well. For comparison, Ivan Turgenev's book, for example, was being sold for 4 rubles. So Tolstoy couldn't sell his writings, his short stories at that time, and he became hugely disappointed. He writes also in one of his diaries that I was mad at people, I was mad at myself, I was disgusted with myself and with people, and he stops writing for an extensive amount of time. So he doesn't return to writing for a long time. But later on, of course, he does return, and he writes War and Peace. So this is the video that I wanted to make. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it was interesting. For me, it was hugely interesting to prepare the story behind the Sevastopol Sketches. I was fascinated by finding all of these diary entries and his letters. The next video which I will publish will be just a review of the stories, discussing some of their topics, discussing some of their techniques. So we will just talk about the stories themselves, whereas in this video I want to talk about the history behind them. I hope you enjoyed, I hope it was interesting. Thank you very much for watching. Thank you if you're still here. Thank you, I appreciate it so much that you have watched up until this moment. Thank you. I hope you're having a very good day. I hope you are reading wonderful books. I hope you will give try to Tolstoy's short stories. And yeah, have a good day. Enjoy your reading, and I will see you soon in my next videos. Thank you very much. Bye.